There are nights in television history that nobody talks about anymore, not because they were forgettable, but because they were so uncomfortable that everyone involved quietly agreed to bury them. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 30 years. 30 years of live television, where anything could happen and sometimes the worst possible thing did. He sat across from presidents, legends, and icons, people who had built empires on charm and composure. But behind that curtain, in the minutes before the cameras rolled, some of those same legends were falling apart. And when they walked out under those studio lights, Johnny Carson had exactly one tool to save the moment: his own composure. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. What follows are 10 of the most infamous appearances in Tonight Show history. 10 nights where Hollywood's biggest names showed up in states that no producer, no director, no amount of rehearsal could have prepared anyone for. These are not rumors. These are not exaggerated anecdotes passed down through decades of bar talk. These moments were captured on live television, watched by millions, and replayed enough times that the people involved spent years trying to forget them. Some of these appearances turned into comedy gold. Others turned into genuine moments of concern, where you could see Johnny Carson quietly calculating how to get through the next few minutes without humiliating someone on national television. A few of them ended with phone calls the next morning that changed booking policies forever. So if you think you know what chaos on live television looks like, you might want to reconsider, because what happened on these 10 nights was something else entirely. Let us start at number 1. Dean Martin was one of the most naturally gifted entertainers the 20th century ever produced. His own variety show made him look effortless, smooth, untouchable, a man who could hold a room without ever appearing to try. But effortless is a performance, and performances require a certain baseline of control. When Dean Martin walked onto the Tonight Show set, that baseline was not always there. He had a habit of arriving with a drink already in hand, which in Hollywood was almost a signature move, something playful, something that reinforced the image. But once he sat down across from Carson, the playfulness started cracking. He would slur through punchlines that were supposed to land clean. He would stumble over the names of his own films. He would greet Johnny Carson as though they had never met before, as though the man sitting 3 feet away was a stranger at a party he had wandered into by accident. Carson would try to steer things, tossing Dean easy questions, the kind of softballs that a man of Martin's talent could have hit in his sleep. Instead, Martin would cut him off mid-sentence, drift into stories that had no ending, or suddenly stand up and wander toward the band as though the cameras had stopped rolling. He mixed up movie titles. He forgot which project he was there to promote. Mid-conversation, his train of thought would simply vanish, and he would sit there for a beat too long, blinking, before trying to pick up a thread that no longer existed. The producers behind the scenes learned quickly. Whenever Dean Martin was on the schedule, they quietly built in buffer time. His segments could stall out. They could run long in ways that made no sense. Sometimes an emergency commercial break was the only escape route. The legend was still there in flashes. You could hear it in the way his voice carried, in the occasional line that reminded everyone in that room exactly why Dean Martin was famous. But those flashes came less and less reliably, and every appearance started to feel like a gamble, a coin flip between the man who made Hollywood glamorous and a man who was visibly struggling to hold the persona together. Ed McMahon was supposed to be the one person on The Tonight Show who never made mistakes. He was Carson's right-hand man, the announcer, the straight man, the steady presence who kept everything anchored no matter how wild a segment got. So when Ed McMahon showed up visibly intoxicated, it did not just derail a segment, it shook something fundamental about the way the show operated. The night in question involved a guest from the San Diego Zoo, a woman named Joan Embry, who had been appearing on the program for years. Ed fixated on exactly how many years she had been coming on. Was it 7? Was it 8? Was it 9? He could not let it go. He kept arguing with Johnny about it, insisting he was right, doubling down even when the math made no sense, and even when Carson was gently trying to move the conversation forward. When Johnny finally steered toward the actual segment, toward the animals, toward the reason Joan was there in the first place, Ed drifted off into rambling stories about baby lions that had no clear point and no clear ending. Carson tried to regain control with humor, teasing Ed about needing a nap, asking him to snap out of it. But McMahon swung between defensiveness and an odd sentimentality, growing emotional for reasons nobody could identify, then slipping into confusion about what he had said just moments before. He kept interrupting Joan every time she tried to speak. Carson finally made the call to bring Joan out quickly, to salvage what was left of the segment before it collapsed entirely. It became one of those rare Tonight Show moments where the audience saw behind the curtain in a way they were never supposed to. Ed McMahon, the most reliable man on television, rambling and argumentative, and completely out of rhythm, forcing Johnny Carson into damage control mode he had never needed to use on his own partner. Truman Capote arrived at The Tonight Show in 1980 in a state so far removed from sobriety that the segment became genuinely difficult to watch. This was not a man who was slightly buzzed or loosened up by a couple of drinks. This was a man who could barely walk to the guest chair without steadying himself on the furniture along the way. He shuffled across the stage. He gripped Johnny's desk before lowering himself into the seat. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. Carson greeted him, hoping the worst of it was cosmetic, hoping that once they started talking, Capote would find his footing. He did not. Capote slurred through almost every word. Large portions of what he said were completely unintelligible. The audience sat in stunned silence. This was Truman Capote. This was the man who wrote in cold blood. One of the most celebrated authors in American literary history was sitting on national television and could not finish a sentence. Carson asked about his latest writing project. Capote launched into a story about a party in the Hamptons and someone's dog that nobody could follow. He would start one thought, lose it entirely, then begin another thought and lose that one too. At one point he turned toward Ed McMahon and asked completely seriously if he could sit in his lap. Ed laughed nervously. Johnny tried to redirect. Capote grabbed a glass of water and brought it toward his mouth, but his aim was off. The rim hit his chin. Water ran down the front of his shirt. He did not notice. The audience did not laugh. After roughly 7 minutes, Carson called for an early commercial break. They came back for 2 more minutes, kept it brief, and ended the segment. Capote made his way back through the curtain, the same way he had come in, shuffling, unsteady, disappearing from view. He was never invited back. The appearance became one of the most infamous clips in Tonight Show history. A Pulitzer Prize-winning author who showed up so far gone that he could barely remain upright on one of the most watched programs in America. Shelley Winters was not a stranger to arriving at The Tonight Show in a compromised state, but her 1974 appearance was something different. It was not just drunk television. It was a masterclass in how completely one guest can take a live show hostage. From the moment she walked through that curtain, she was a force that nobody in that studio could contain. She interrupted Johnny Carson constantly, talking over him, talking over the other guests, talking over anyone who opened their mouth. There were 2 other people on that set that night, and Shelley made it functionally impossible for either of them to say a single word. Carson asked her questions. She ignored them entirely and launched into rants about people the audience had never heard of. A young actor was there that night to promote his first major film. This was the biggest night of his career up to that point. Shelley turned to him, grabbed his knee, and started mocking his movie on live television. She called it boring. She called his performance wooden. The young man sat there with a frozen smile, completely unsure what was happening to him. Carson tried to defend the actor. Shelley was not listening. Then she noticed the note cards on Johnny's desk, the questions his writers had prepared. She reached across, grabbed the entire stack out of his hands, and threw them over her shoulder, scattering them across the floor behind the couch like they were trash. Carson sat there speechless. In 30 years of hosting, no guest had ever done that. The audience gasped. Shelley kept talking as though nothing had happened. After about 12 minutes, Carson looked directly into the camera and announced they were going to commercial. The aftermath was swift. NBC producers told Shelley Winters' agent that she was not welcome back on The Tonight Show. The ban lasted nearly 3 years. When she was eventually allowed to return, someone had a very serious conversation with her beforehand about the expectations. Show up sober. Do not attack other guests. Do not touch Johnny's materials. Orson Welles was a singular talent, the kind of performer who could fill a room just by being in it. But singular talents come with singular risks, and when Orson Welles had been drinking, the risk was that he would simply take over everything around him and refuse to give it back. His 1975 appearance is the clearest example. He had been drinking wine in his dressing room before the show. Crew members saw it. By the time he walked out onto the set, it was obvious he was tipsy. But he was also Orson Welles, which meant that even in a compromised state, he was more articulate, more commanding, and more intellectually alive than most people are at their best. Carson asked one question. And Orson launched into a monologue that ran 14 minutes without interruption. He started with a Shakespeare analysis that was genuinely sharp. Then he drifted into his own career, then back to the history of theater, then into an anecdote about a Hungarian director that nobody in that studio had ever heard of. At one point he attempted to quote Hamlet. He got 3 lines in before the actual text of Shakespeare left him entirely, so he made up new lines that sounded Shakespearean but were completely fabricated. He delivered them with total confidence. Johnny Carson sat there for 14 minutes, waiting for any opening, any pause, any breath long enough to jump in. Welles never gave him one. The audience was captivated, because even a wasted Orson Welles turned out to be more compelling television than most guests delivered sober. But it was still chaos. One man on wine, talking about whatever crossed his mind, on live television, with no structure and no exit strategy. Despite all of it, Carson kept inviting him back. Because when Orson Welles was working, he was extraordinary. The problem was you never knew which version was going to walk through that curtain. Oliver Reed holds a unique distinction on this list. He is the only person here who never actually appeared on The Tonight Show, because Johnny Carson made the decision to cancel the booking before it ever happened. Reed was scheduled for a 1973 appearance. He was a rising star in Hollywood at the time, the kind of guest that should have made for compelling television. But NBC executives had seen footage of Reed's behavior on other talk shows. They had watched him threaten to remove his clothing on air. They had seen him insult hosts directly to their faces. They had documented him demanding alcohol during interviews and becoming physically aggressive. The executives brought the tapes to Carson. Johnny watched them. He watched Oliver Reed lose control on program after program, watched the hosts around him scramble to contain the damage. And then Carson made his call. The appearance was canceled, pulled from the schedule entirely. Oliver Reed never set foot on The Tonight Show during Johnny Carson's entire 30-year run. Reed responded publicly. He called Carson scared. He called him uptight. Carson did not respond. He had spent 3 decades managing chaos on live television. He had seen enough guests unravel in front of millions to know exactly what kind of guest was worth the risk and what kind was not. Oliver Reed was not worth it. Peter O'Toole was the kind of actor who could deliver genius or absolute chaos depending entirely on the day, and sometimes both within the same 10 minutes. His 1978 Tonight Show appearance landed squarely in that territory. He arrived after a heavy afternoon of drinking. The smell was noticeable. Carson asked about Lawrence of Arabia, the obvious question, the safe entry point. O'Toole ignored it completely and instead began lecturing on the craft of acting. It was a brilliant monologue, genuinely insightful, the kind of unscripted commentary that reminded everyone watching why O'Toole was considered one of the greatest screen actors of his generation. And then, mid-thought, the brilliance dissolved into confused rambling that had no clear destination. Then it snapped back to brilliance again. Then it dissolved again. The swing between the two was so fast and so unpredictable that Carson could never quite find his footing. At one point, O'Toole picked up Johnny's pen off the desk and began wielding it like a fencing sword, forcing Carson into a physical exchange right there on camera. Johnny was laughing. He was also clearly trying to regain control of the segment, Then O'Toole launched into stories about Richard Harris, stories about drinking and misbehavior that almost certainly should not have been told on network television. It was chaotic from start to finish. But it was also oddly charming, the kind of chaos that audiences found themselves leaning into rather than away from. Carson kept bringing O'Toole back because a sloshed Peter O'Toole was still more entertaining than most guests who showed up completely sober and fully prepared. Foster Brooks built an entire career on the performance of being drunk. Slurred words, stumbling walk, forgotten names, confused expressions. It was his act, his character, the thing that made audiences laugh. The irony is that on at least 2 of his Tonight Show appearances, the act and the reality were happening at the same time. Brooks often had a drink or 2 before going on stage. It was part of his routine, a way to warm up, to get into the character's headspace. Most of the time it worked, but on certain nights the warm-up went too far. And when that happened, something strange occurred on camera. The carefully rehearsed drunk act began to slip, and the real version started bleeding through underneath it. He would lose track of his own bit mid-performance. The slurring that was supposed to be exaggerated for laughs became genuinely thick. The stumbling that was choreographed became unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with comedy. Carson picked up on the shift immediately. He recognized the difference between a man performing inebriation and a man who was actually experiencing it. So he shifted into rescue mode. He turned the moment into something the audience could laugh at without understanding exactly why, playing along as though the whole thing was part of the act. Crew members who watched from backstage knew better. The line between the character Foster Brooks created and the man underneath it had blurred in a way that made for uncomfortable television, even if the audience never fully realized what they were watching. Robert Blake arrived at The Tonight Show on one particular night in a state that went well beyond being buzzed or loosened up. Multiple staff members described his energy that evening as running on liquid courage, and what followed was one of the more genuinely unsettling segments in the show's history. He walked out through the curtain, and the audience applauded the way they always did, expecting the tough, charismatic presence Blake usually brought to talk shows. Within seconds of sitting down, the energy in the room shifted. He was bouncing his leg. He was tapping his fingers against the armrest. His eyes were wide and unfocused, scanning the audience as though daring someone to challenge him. Carson asked the standard opening question, something simple about Blake's latest project. Blake did not answer it. He jumped straight into a story about working as a child actor on studio backlots, and he told it with a jittery intensity that made the room go silent. Then, without any transition at all, he spun back to the present day and started accusing modern actors of never having earned anything. Carson tried to lighten the mood. Blake did not notice. He kept going, one topic bleeding into the next, with no connective tissue, no pause, no acknowledgement that there was another person at that desk trying to have a conversation. At one point, Blake stood up entirely unprompted, acting out a scene from his new film. The camera operator scrambled to keep him in frame. Carson held up his hands, gently trying to get him to sit back down. Instead, Blake leaned over the desk and launched into another monologue about the pressure of decades in the business. It was not angry in any simple way. It was scattered and emotional and impossible to read. Carson kept trying to reset the conversation with softball questions. Blake swatted each one away, circling back to old grievances, to frustrations, to whatever thought surfaced next. More than once, Carson raised his eyebrows toward Ed McMahon with that silent look he used when things were slipping out of reach. Ed nodded slightly. The band eventually started playing for the commercial break. Blake kept talking. Carson stood, placed a hand on Blake's shoulder in a way that communicated everything without saying a word. Blake finally stopped. The audience gave that strange, split applause that people give when they cannot decide whether something was entertaining or frightening. Carson smiled for the camera. The moment the red light went off, his expression changed completely. He walked back to his desk without any of the casual bits he usually exchanged with the band. Blake stayed in his chair, still talking to anyone who would listen. A stagehand eventually approached and quietly asked him to head backstage. Blake shrugged like nothing unusual had happened and shuffled off, still muttering. Carson came through the hallway still in his suit, tie loosened just slightly. He thanked Blake professionally. The words were polite. The tone behind them was not warm. The moment Blake left the building, Carson turned to his producer and made it simple. Next time, they needed to know exactly what they were getting. If Blake had been drinking, they were passing. That conversation turned into a standing policy within hours. Blake's name on the booking sheets carried a quiet note from that point forward. Confirm his state before confirming the appearance. If there was any indication he had been drinking, suggest a different date or a different show. It was not personal. Carson's entire empire rested on the idea that he could manage live chaos just enough to keep it entertaining. A sober Blake was manageable, even compelling. But the other version of Robert Blake was chaos that nobody in that studio knew how to contain, and after that night, nobody wanted to find out again. Every single person on this list revealed something the same about live television. No matter how tightly you control the format, no matter how carefully you vet the guests, no matter how much experience the host has accumulated over decades of doing this, chaos finds a way in. Johnny Carson spent 30 years managing that chaos with a grace and a quick thinking that no other host has matched since. Some nights he turned the chaos into comedy. Some nights he ended segments early and moved on. And some nights he simply decided before the cameras ever rolled that certain guests were not worth the risk at all. But every one of these moments, the charming ones and the uncomfortable ones and the genuinely alarming ones, exists as a reminder that live television is never fully under anyone's control. Sometimes someone walks through that curtain in a state that no one anticipated, and all you can do is hold your composure, keep the smile in place, and survive the next few minutes. Which of these stories hit you the hardest? Were there other Tonight Show moments like these that we left off this list? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more stories from the 30-year run of The Tonight Show, make sure you hit subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next.